Welcome to the Week Ahead, a podcast by SBM Intelligence. I'm your host, Veronica Pana Ikube. Every Friday, we explore stories that are shaping our continent. The United States has withdrawn non-essential staff from Abuja due to security concerns, highlighting rising caution over safety conditions in Nigeria's capital. Will this signal deeper diplomatic concerns or lead to stronger security assurances from the government? In Borno State, an airstrike killed civilians. The military has defended the operations. Meanwhile, nearly 400 suspected militants were arrested, and the police arrested suspects following the church abductions in Kwara. Can the authorities balance security operations with civilian protections and trust? Ghana has denied reports of plans to host an EU military base, reaffirming its sovereignty and dismissing the claims as false. Will this be enough to calm concerns about foreign military presence in the region? Joining us today for further insights is Confidence Makari, a security analyst with SBM Intelligence. Welcome, Confidence, to the podcast.
Hi Veronica, it's good to be back here. How are you doing?
Fine. Let's start with our first story where we see the US has taken steps to withdraw non-essential staff from Abuja due to security concerns. What is this signaling to Nigeria as a country as well? And what is it signaling to international organization, bodies, investors? Why do you think that the US they said it was because of security concerns, but do you think that there are deeper um reasons for this? And what do you think will be the implication of this withdrawal?
To begin with, the security in and around Abuja has been deteriorating for a while, and in the lead up to this issue, we've seen the Americans issue a red alert. I think about a month earlier, at warning its citizens about it. In the latest round of advisory, it's doubled down by adding southern states, including, I think, even up to River State as part of its places for Nigerian citizens to be wary of traveling to. And so the overall picture and the sense it gives is that um, it, it's more of a thing of the house collapsing on itself, and that the FCT is being the arrowhead, being the linchpin where the Nigerian government is not safe, is not secure. And now there are a lot of things that could be said about how the intelligence came from, especially as vague as it is. And by vague, I mean that we do not know exactly what the specific threat that the Americans saw that make them decide to issue that alert. But from the Nigerian government perspective, it's a different thing. It doesn't really seem to be the case for them. Of course, there have been a couple of security disturbances in the capital, but the bulk of the terrorism threats is not necessarily within the capital itself. Especially in terms of the way and manner or the strength of the threats when it comes to Islamist terrorism. But they're in the adjoining areas in Kogi, in Niger State, where um, you know many of the forests or some of the forests that are on the border with Kwara, on the boundary with Kwara, and then on the border with the Benin Republic have been taken over by Islamist groups. So I think it remains to be seen the exact threat, the specific threat that the Americans saw and decided to issue that alert. But but the bulk of the issue is that the FCT for a while has been insecure, and the signal is that the Nigerian government seems to have lost control on security in its capital, and as a result, the Americans are having to strenuously warn the citizens about the risk of insecurity, not just in the capital, but just everywhere around the country.
Okay, so Abuja is seen as the capital of Nigeria, and it hasn't really had so many like security incidents that would threaten like the American embassy to say, you know what, I'll call back our essential workers. What do you think is the security issues or are the security issues that pushed the US to, call some of their workers back to the country?
I think two may stand out among others. The first is the Islamist threat, the threat for Islamist terrorism. As I said previously, some of the states that border Abuja are seeing some of the worst security deterioration the country has witnessed in real time. I'm talking Nasarawa, I'm talking Niger State, where, like I said previously, in the boundary between Niger and Kwara, you see a host of Al-Qaeda aligned Islamist groups, Mahmuda, JNIM, the JAS faction of Boko Haram, and several other ones causing trouble in Niger State, which is Nigeria's biggest by landmass. And then you have the same groups causing issues in Kwara State just next door. And if you also take away from that, you also look at Fulani headsmen violence in Nasarawa. You also look at both a mix of kidnapped groups as well as Islamist groups causing mayhem in Kogi. So if you look at the map, you see that on all sides the FCT seems a little surrounded, and that is just one threat. There's also the threat of kidnapping, which in many parts of Buari local council area seems to be the run of the mill. It's not an exception; it's the norm in several parts of the FCT, and so movement and logistics in and around the capital have become increasingly problematic from a security standpoint. So I can understand if you put all of these things together and aggregate them, it makes some sort of sense why the Americans are issuing this advisory at the moment.
Interesting. We hope that the Nigerian government can put this under control as well, because last week
Mm.
on the podcast we had sad story of the military officer who lost his life, and now this week again we're just seeing repeated strikes. It feels like there's an escalation, especially
Mm.
in states like Borno. For our second story, we're seeing Borno State airstrike, where civilians were killed. We're also seeing 400 suspected militants being arrested. Police were able to arrest suspects following the Kwara abduction case incident. We're just seeing a lot of, like clusters of security issues happening around the country. But it feels like there's an escalation. And it feels like as much as the government tries to control, there's still like more responses. What do you think is going wrong? Do you feel like it's the election season that is causing this? Or you've seen responses from some government officials saying, I think the Senate president also made that statement, saying, it's because of the election season. That's why we're seeing an increase of um insecurity and incidents happening. But do you think it's as a result of that, or do you just see that um those who are perpetrating these crimes just feel like we have been doing it, we're getting away with it, and nothing is happening, and they're becoming more bold, and you know just acting without any care for what's happening in the country?
Yeah, I don't agree with that identification of the problem because the most direct causal link between security and politics, especially when the political season begins, is the uptick in uh, po political violence or attacks on rallies, campaign materials, and several other things that have to do with politics and elections. That's not what we're seeing now. We're seeing full-blown terrorism. We're seeing a continuation of the kidnap for ransom thing that is going on. We've seen a lot of other regular security issues, national security issues that have remained over time. So I think trying to attribute it to the coming political season doesn't really do justice to it.
I know that's just really sad. But do you think that the authorities can balance security operations and ensure that civilians are protected as well? Because in the last incident in Borno, we saw um civilians being affected by, the kind of like push back or attack on insurgents. So how do you think that security forces can ensure that civilians are protected in their fight against terrorism and insecurity?
They would need to be a lot more human facing in their operations. And I mean, when I say human facing, I mean that it is not enough for you to just carry out an operation, despite whether or not civilians will be caught up. There needs to be a lot more respect for human life and dignity. And one thing a lot of people do not understand concerning this latest, area bombardment of civilians, especially in the northeast, is down to the fact that there seems to be a little bit of a no love lost between civilians and the Nigerian military in Borno, because there is this information warfare that is going on. And sometimes, whenever there's an attack, a successful attack on a military base in Borno, the military turn the guns on the civilians and then persecute them for allegedly hosting either the terrorists or knowing about the attack and then not doing anything concerning it. And I think that animosity has largely crept into the Nigerian Air Force's operation, so much so that the bombs that dropped on the civilians in Gili in Yobe were more of a thing of no need for discrimination, that everybody and anybody can get that at the same time, despite the fact that there was not enough credible intelligence to state that the people who were in the market at the time, which of course, to be fair to the Nigerian military, was frequented by ISWAP, that they were ISWAP fighters themselves. So that whole rivalry, or I don't want to say rivalry now because they're not the same thing or the same people, but that bad blood between the Nigerian military and civilians in the places where these operations are taking place have just seemed to sow relations so badly that it is quite almost impossible for the Nigerian military to show that kind of a human restraint or human sympathy or even self-restraint whenever carrying out attacks from the air.
Hmm. I mean, that's really, really important because I mean, the military needs to ensure that in their carrying out their operations, that civilians are protected as well. Um,
Yeah.
and that builds a kind of like trust as well, on the part of citizens as well. Onto our final story where Ghana has denied reports of plans to host an EU military base. Do you think why is this story coming out and why would the EU want to have a military base in Ghana? I mean, that's just my thoughts out there, but will this be enough? Them just saying, "Oh no, we denying it." Do you think that that's enough to calm concerns about foreign military presence in the region? Why do you think? I mean, it's really interesting to know like why would a foreign country or the EU want to have its military base, especially like in West Africa and Ghana in this instance? And what will be the
Uh,
effect it actually have on?
we- Yeah, we need to understand that given the current geopolitical climate in the region, partnerships or military or security partnerships with the West and the East are taking on much more greater scrutiny. If Right. So 15 years ago, if this news was something that was making the rounds, I do not think that a Ghana EU military cooperation would have made front lines or headlines. But the world has gone beyond 15 years from now, and the region specifically has been in the geopolitical doldrums, in the sense that on one hand, you have the West, and on the other hand, you have the East, and then the restive population, especially of young people that are moving largely towards pro-Eastern sentiments. And which is why it is important for the EU to put out this disclaimer, because from their own perspective, what the deal is about with the Ghanaians was an agreement that focuses only on training, counter-terrorism, and equipment to support and strengthen national security. But given some of the things that have happened on the continent or in this part of the continent over the last couple of years, that apprehension has been growing, in the sense that a lot of anti-Western sentiments has built up. So any sort of thing about security partnership or security cooperation is viewed with the lens that the West wants to set up a military base for which to counter either Russia or China. And, all of those geopolitical rivalries that play out elsewhere on the world, are being played out in West Africa at the moment. So I think I sort of understand why the narrative will be spinned to say that such a military base is being set up in Ghana. There are a couple of security threats that warrant these agreements. In northern Ghana, sometime 2 months ago, we saw the Taitao attack where a couple of tomato buyers and sellers were killed on the border with Burkina Faso. The GNIM threat is threatening to spill over into Ghana, and then Ghana also has its own communal clashes in the upper east region, and several other issues that the country have had to deal with over the past couple of years. So it makes sense why they will want to go to the EU with needs for training and counter-terrorism support. But this cannot be divorced from the larger sentiments in the region where we've had Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso moved away from its traditional Western partnership, cutting the East, by which they've gotten a lot of help in terms of hardware from Turkey and advisory services from the Russians, and sometimes even combats in Mali from the Russians. And so whenever you have this military cooperation, either from East or West, there's a tendency that is going to be looked from the prism of wanting to establish a military presence and a military base in the country.
Thank you very much, Confidence. That brings us to the end of today's episode. It's such a pleasure having you on the podcast.
Thank you.
To all our listeners, this podcast is by SBM Intelligence. You can access our podcast by searching for SBM Intelligence anywhere you find podcasts. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe, like, and share, and let us know your thoughts in the comment section. For deeper insights into our work, you can visit our website at sbmintel.com. Remember to connect with us on all our social media platforms. You can find us on X, Facebook, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn at SBM Intelligence. Thank you for tuning in to the week ahead. Join us next Friday for more updates shaping the African continent.